Hey folks, this week the topic is different kinds of sculpture. Last week we looked at sculpture that was carved, meaning you take a block of something, be it wood, stone, or ice, and you chip away at it to get whatever kind of shape that you want, or cast, where you take metal or plastic or whatever and you pour it into a mold. Well, this week we're going to look at other kinds of sculptures that are more atypical kinds of artwork. These kinds of sculptures really came to be in the 20th century and 21st century. I think you're gonna like them. They're my favorite. The first one is an installation. In an installation, an artist transforms an entire space with sculpture, and viewers are encouraged to walk around and explore the sculpture. So think the sculptures last week were just one object like a bowl or a sculpture of a person. These are entire rooms or spaces that have been transformed, and sometimes there's lots and lots and lots of sculptures in that space, and the viewer is meant to walk around. So I brought in a few examples of things that I have actually seen. This is an installation in the Guggenheim Museum. I have been there. I saw this installation, and basically what it is the artist sewed these, like, they're not really wool. Are they wolves? Yeah, they're wolves. Wolves, coyotes, something like that. He made a lot of them, like 100 or 200 or 300 of them, and then they're running around in the gallery. This gallery is round. They're running around in the gallery. They're not real, they're taxidermied. And then you, the viewer, are just walking around in the space of these stuffed coyotes. They're not real coyotes, everything is completely fake. But it's a totally different experience of sculpture than seeing a sculpture like under glass. So you're walking around, you're looking at these sewn wolf things. And then you see, when you get to the end, you see that they are crashing against this glass wall and then going back to the beginning as if it never happened. Oh, and here's some people walking around amidst the herd of coyote. It looks like coyotes. Anyway, that's a great example of an installation. There's lots and lots of different individual sculptures, and the viewer is meant to walk around, sometimes even touch the actual sculpture. Here's another one, actually by the same artist. This is another one that I've actually seen. It's really amazing in person. The artist took 9 white Ford Taurus cars and then hung them, suspended them on wires. And you see what the car is doing. The car is making a kind of flip, and then, just like the wolves, returning back to the very beginning. And that flip can be different ways. It can be a circle like it is in this one, or it can be coming out of the sky like it is in this one. So how the cars are arranged varies depending on the space that the artist is putting this sculpture in. In a box type space, it makes more sense for them to go in a circle. In a very tall space, it makes more sense for them to fall out of the sky. But the point is that the cars are doing this flip, then landing as if they are fine, and then at the same time these lights are shooting out. These are like LED lights. It's really impressive, really amazing to see in person. Think about movies that you've watched where the something terrible happens to the car, like you're watching this car chase and like people are shooting at the car and the car is maybe riding over other cars, or maybe it's doing a flip and it lands and it's perfectly fine, and you think, man, that would not be my car. My car, the slightest little thing happens and it's completely dead. But we watch these movies with these very unrealistic things happening to cars, like, for example, the James Bond movies, or Mission Impossible, or the Fast and Furious. That's what this artist was inspired by. These movies that we watch where these crazy things are happening to cars and somehow they are perfectly fine. The sculpture is this spinning car, and then you, the viewer, are just walking around and you're just on the escalator and looking at these cars. It's very, very cool. I saw this particular piece, the cars, at the Seattle Art Museum. It was in the place where you wait in line to get in the museum. So you're waiting in line, and as you're going up the stairs and up the escalators to get into the museum, you're going by these spinning cars, and it's just a very, very, very cool thing. It's very atypical for art. We've looked at art that's painting and drawing, and this is really, really different. This is another kind of sculpture. It is similar to an installation, and often these are installations as well, but this is called site-specific. And a site-specific work is basically an artist selects a particular location for a work of art and puts a sculpture in that particular location. And the fact that the sculpture is there gives the work enhanced meaning, which means that if the sculpture was somewhere else, it wouldn't make as much sense. The sculpture has to be in that particular spot in order for it to have the meaning that it does. If you were to put the sculpture somewhere else, it wouldn't be the same. It wouldn't mean as much. And that's the case with this one. Spiral Jetty, you see what it is. It's basically this rock spiral. And this spiral jetty is in the Great Salt Lake in Utah. And it's by the artist Robert Smithson. Now, we think of art as being in art galleries or art as being in art museums. This artwork is not in a museum. This artwork is in the Great Salt Lake. In order to see it, you have to go to the Great Salt Lake, or you can, if you go to an art museum, you might see a picture of it. But the only place to see it is the Great Salt Lake, because that's where it is. And it can't be moved. It's made of rock. And also, the fact that it is in the Great Salt Lake is particular to Robert Smithson. The spiral jetty wouldn't make sense anywhere except the Great Salt Lake. It has to be there in order to make sense. So site-specific is a difficult concept for a lot of people to understand, because it doesn't have to do with whether the thing could be moved. It doesn't have to do with whether you could pick it up and move the sculpture somewhere else. It has to do with that space is very particular. That location is very particular, and that location gives the sculpture meaning. And so when I'm in class, I usually ask folks to think about something else that might be site specific, that they might have known about, that the object has to be in that place in order for it to make sense. And I've got a lot of examples, but here is a really good one. This is the memorial to the USS Arizona in Pearl Harbor. I've actually been there. It's a very, very powerful experience if you ever have a chance. So the USS Arizona is this sunken ship. And it's in Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and this was the ship that was sunk during the bombing of Pearl Harbor at the beginning of World War II. The memorial is this floating structure that is on top of the USS Arizona. So if you are going to visit the memorial, basically you walk out onto this dock and you take a boat here. And then you're on this floating memorial, and you see that there are windows here, and you're looking over the side onto the actual sunken ship. And that's very important. The memorial to the USS Arizona is on top of the USS Arizona. You are looking out at the oil. Periodically, actually, even though it's many, many years later, oil still rises to the surface. You're actually on top of the watery graves of the soldiers that went down with the USS Arizona. Yes, it is possible that the memorial to the USS Arizona could be somewhere else. They could have put it in Washington, D.C., but it makes more sense to have the memorial on top of the actual boat, on top of the actual ship where it happened. In the same way, the memorials to the World Trade Center of September 11th, they are actually in the spot where the towers used to be. The memorial to the Pentagon, where the Pentagon was blown up, it's actually in that spot. And there's a memorial. A even better example is one of the things that happened on September 11th was a plane was flying over Pennsylvania, and the passengers on the plane actually brought it down, so it wasn't able to get its target. And there's a memorial in the actual spot where the plane went down, in the middle of rural Pennsylvania. It's not a city. It's not Washington, D.C. It's where the actual plane went down. That's site specific. Yes, it is possible that the memorial could be somewhere else, but it makes sense where the event happened. It makes sense for the memorial to the USS Arizona to be on the exact spot where the ship is. It makes sense for the memorial to the plane that went down September 11th in Pennsylvania, for the memorial to be actually where the plane went down. That is an example of site specific. So Spiral Jetty, the one we were looking at, it has to be in the Great Salt Lake. It makes sense at the Great Salt Lake. It would not make sense elsewhere. Even if it could technically be moved, it doesn't make sense somewhere else. So why is that? Well, it's kind of a funny story. I honestly think that the Spiral Jetty is a weird sculpture. I can't, I mean, more power to Robert Smithson, but the idea of building this thing out basically in the middle of nowhere. I mean, you can see it. There isn't any civilization out there. It is literally in the middle of nowhere. The idea of making this thing is a little bit ludicrous to me. So basically what happened was Robert Smithson is from, oh, excuse me, dogs are barking. I'll be right back. Okay, sorry about that. I'm really trying to not tick off my neighbors with my barking foster dog. Okay, so Robert Smithson's from New Jersey, and this is like 1970s. Artists are driving out to the West and basically tripping out on the expanse of Western nature. They just can't believe the tall mountains and the big space and all of the beautiful, majestic things that make up the American West. So, Robert Smithson, of all things in the American West, the thing that he is most fascinated by is the Great Salt Lake. And, I mean, I don't know why, but he loved the Great Salt Lake. He was really interested in a few things about the Great Salt Lake. The first thing that he was interested in is the salt in the Great Salt Lake. The Great Salt Lake has more salt than the oceans. The percentage of salt is higher than the oceans in the world. He was also interested in something else. And you can see the salt. The salt this is Spiral Jetty underwater. The water level in the Great Salt Lake fluctuates, and so sometimes Spiral Jetty is underwater. But you can see the salt here and here. There's basically just salt everywhere. The other thing he was interested in is the Great Salt Lake is not just full of salt. There's also a bacteria that grows in the Great Salt Lake. It is a bacteria that makes the color of the water red. So this color right here that you see right there, that's actually bacteria. So there's no fish or anything in the Great Salt Lake. There's basically two things. There's salt, and you can see the salt really well here. Whenever the Spiral Jetty emerges from being submerged, it is covered with salt crystals. So there's basically two things in the Great Salt Lake that were interesting to Robert Smithson. First, there was salt, lots of salt, and the second thing was that there was this bacteria that makes the water red. And both of these things happen to be spiral-shaped, or they have a spiral-shaped chemical structure. The salt has a spiral-shaped chemical structure, and the bacteria has a spiral-shaped chemical structure. And this got Robert Smithson thinking about spirals. and kind of how spirals are integral to nature. They're like an integral form in nature, both big spirals and little spirals. So big spirals being like galaxies or tornadoes or hurricanes or whirlpools, and so really, really the Milky Way, like really, really, really big spirals, super sized spirals. And then there's really, really tiny spirals as well, such as the chemical structure of this bacteria and this salt. Other tiny spirals, think about it, like seashells are an example of a tiny spiral, or when ferns are coming out in the spring, they're spiral shaped. There's a lot. You could say DNA is double helix, but you could say it's like a spiral. So Robert Smithson started thinking that maybe the spiral was the essence to all life. The essence of living things, of biology, was a spiral. The Great Salt Lake doesn't have anything really living in it except for this bacteria that happens to be spiral shaped. So even the simplest life forms have a spiral as their essence. So that's why he decided to put a spiral in the Great Salt Lake, is to reference this two things. One, the nature of spirals to life. And then two, also he was just tripping out about spirals in nature. Anyway, as you can see, yes, it would be possible to move the spiral jetty to a different lake. It would be possible to put it in Lake Michigan. It would be possible to put it in Name Your Lake. It would be possible to put it there, but it wouldn't make sense. The spiral jetty is about the Great Salt Lake. It's about the spiral-shaped salt in the Great Salt Lake. It is about the spiral-shaped bacteria in the Great Salt Lake. It is about the spiral as being essential to life. Lake Michigan doesn't have salt. Lake Michigan doesn't have that spiral-shaped bacteria, so it just wouldn't make sense there. That's site-specific. Even if it's possible to move it, it wouldn't make sense to move the sculpture. Here's another one. Site-specific works are all over the West, and they are all pretty crazy. And this is why they're among my favorite works of art. I mostly because I think they're crazy. So what is this one? This is a sculpture by the artist. His name is Walter de Maria, another New York-based artist who came out to the West and basically tripped out on Western nature. And what he decided to construct is, you can see what they are. They're basically lightning rods. They're about 20 feet tall, so they're very, very, very tall. They don't look that tall in this picture. And they're 2 square miles. 2 square miles of lightning rods. And the lightning rods are at an even distance. I can't remember the distance, but it's like every 20 or 30 feet, there's another lightning rod. And it's like basically a grid. It's a 2 square mile grid of lightning rods. There's hundreds of lightning rods out there. And Walter de Maria put this in a spot where there is an above average number of lightning storms every year. So this is a place that gets more lightning than other places in the country. And he basically just decided to put this grid of lightning rods out there so that whenever there's a lightning storm, there is this amazing show of lightning on the lightning rods. It's really incredible. It doesn't, honestly, it's kind of funny. It doesn't happen very often. And if you go on YouTube, you'll see that there are lots of people that go camping at this particular location. The location is called Lightning Field, waiting for lightning storms to happen. And they just don't happen very much. But they do happen more than other places in the country. They just don't happen all the time. So my tip for you is don't go camping in this spot because you're probably not going to see a lightning storm. But when there is a lightning storm, it is very impressive. Again, it is a site-specific work. It would not make sense somewhere else. The whole point is to put Lightning Field in a place where there are lots and lots and lots of lightning storms, where the likelihood of a lightning storm is higher than other places in the country. And so it only works in this particular spot. That's site-specific. All right, so we've left site specific for now, and we're going to look at earthworks. This is what actually you're going to be making for your assignment this week. You're going to make your own earthworks by going outside and using natural materials. An earthwork is a sculpture where an artist uses the material of that location to make his or her sculpture. Oftentimes, earthworks are temporary or they change over time. So you see that what Andy Goldsworthy has done in this one over here is he's gone out on a snowy day and he's collected icicles. And he's arranged these icicles swirling around this tree. He did not use glue. He did not use nails. He only used the material of the site. So in order to connect the icicles, you'll see this in the video, he actually bites them and licks them to get them to melt and then attaches them to each other, and then they refreeze. Earthworks only use the material of the site. You don't bring anything out there with you. What's going to happen to this thing? Well, it's going to warm up and the sculpture is going to melt. So earthworks are temporary, and earthworks often change over time, or they cease to exist completely. If it's not melting, in this case, he collected these leaves and arranged the leaves in this kind of gradient pattern. Well, what's going to happen is the leaves are going to blow away, or people are going to step on it, whatever. In some way, this thing is going to not exist forever. And that's not the point. The point of earthworks is to use the materials you have, make something using those materials, take pictures of it, and then the earthwork is going to change or cease to exist. So that's the point with earthworks. It's not about an artwork that's going to go into a gallery and last forever. It's about an artwork that you're making in that location, knowing that nature changes. Temperatures change, wind happens, rain happens, and so the sculpture is not permanent. How do you know it ever happened? You take pictures of it. And if you ever go to an art museum to see earthworks, you're not going to actually see the earthwork. You're going to see photographs of the earthwork. What Andy Goldsworthy does, this artist, is he takes these really nice photos of his earthworks and prints them up in books and sells coffee table books. I happen to own one. Excuse me, more barking dogs. I'll be right back. Okay, let's look at some more earthworks by Goldsworthy. They're really, really lovely, and the photographs he takes are great. So in this one, basically it's some sticks, he arranged these sticks around this rock in a creek. Well, what's going to happen is eventually the creek is going to wash the sticks away. And in this one, he went on a rainy day and arranged these yellow leaves on top of this, it looks like a piece of driftwood or something. And again, eventually the rain is going to wash this away. There's no glue, there's no nails. He only uses the materials of the site. Now, earthworks are things that you've made when you were a kid. Think about a time when you've gone out and made something in nature only using the materials of the site. You do it a million times. Snow angels, for example, sand castles, or mud pies, or whatever it is. Forts. I loved to make forts when I was a kid. I would find sticks and branches and things and make forts in the woods. So the main point being that earthworks aren't unusual. They're not something that only artists do. In fact, it's the opposite. It's something that kids do all the time. And then as adults, we just kind of have different ideas about things. This is another one. It's a great example of something Andy Goldsworthy does. He'll go out at low tide, make a sculpture, and then as the tide comes in, the sculpture slowly disintegrates, goes away. And so if we were to keep watching this video, you'll see that the cairn, which is this kind of egg-shaped pile of sticks, or pile of rocks, actually gets destroyed as the high tide comes in. Finally, as a transition to the next unit, which is performance art, which I think you guys are going to like, I wanted to show you this artist. This artist is Ana Mendieta, and Ana Mendieta makes site-specific works, and she also makes earthworks. So her sculptures are a combination of site-specific works and earthworks. And she has a really amazing and tragic story that I'm looking forward to telling you about. So Ana was born in Cuba. She's a Cuban artist, and her parents were involved in the resistance to the Cuban government. And at the time, this was the 1960s, there was a program that brought the children of political protesters to America for asylum. So Ana's parents were political protesters, and they believed that their children were in danger because of their political protesting. Because of their political protesting, they thought their children were in danger. And so the United States had a program to bring the children of Cuban political protesters to America. And Ana and her sister came to America under this program. Ana's mother came a few years later. Ana's father was actually put in prison, and was in prison for 19 years before he was able to join the family. So Ana's parents were right that their children were potentially in danger. So when Ana was very young, God, I think she was 6 years old, maybe 9 years old, she came to America. She left her parents. She wasn't going to see her parents for years until her mom came. And she moved from Cuba to Iowa. Now, and she lived in an orphanage. She lived in an orphanage in Iowa, and then went from foster home to foster home to foster home for much of her childhood. And I want you to imagine what that must have been like as a little kid, to leave your parents, to leave the country that you know, to leave Cuba, to never be able to go back, and to go to a place that is completely foreign to you. I cannot think of a lot of places that are as different from Cuba as Iowa. Ana lived in Iowa. Eventually, her mother was able to join her, and she was able to leave foster care. And she went to art school, and she began a series to what she thinks about is to heal from this traumatic experience of being ripped from her family and ripped from her homeland. Now, admittedly, it was for her own safety, but she was still a kid. It was still traumatic. To be ripped from those places and plopped down in a place that was completely foreign to you. So what she does is she goes out to different places. She goes out to places in Iowa, first of all, and she makes a human form using a woman's form, using the materials of the site. So here she's using sticks, here she's using sand, using mud, here she's using her own body. So she'll go out to Iowa and she'll make these sculptures using the material she has, sculptures of women. And then the other place she went to Cuba. And she did this in Cuba too. And the idea was to connect herself to her land, connect herself to these two places, Iowa and Cuba. So in that way, they are site specific because they speak to Ana's specific experience of being born in Cuba and then moving to Iowa. And they're also earthworks because they use the materials of the land. So they're both things. So the next thing that Ana starts doing, which is really fascinating, is she starts to incorporate fire in her sculptures, which is she'll go out to these places in Iowa and these places in Cuba, and she will make these women sculptures, as she's been doing, using the materials around her in these two places, and then she will set them on fire and film them. And so the final artwork is this video that you can watch in a gallery, and I've actually got one for you guys to watch. Remember, on the sculptures, you can't go to an art museum and see them because they're not in an art museum. They're in Iowa and they're in Cuba, and they get destroyed by nature and by the things that happen. All you can see is photographs. But in the fire sculptures, you can't. It's not a photograph; it's a video. It's a video that you watch, and Earthworks videos of honest sculptures, they kind of bring the next question to mind, which is, does a work of art have to be a physical object? Is Anna's artwork, where it's not a physical object, it's a video of something on fire, is that still artwork, even though there's nothing to put in an art museum? That's the question for next week, is, can you have art that is not a physical object in an art museum? And one thing you might think about is, can you think of examples of artwork that are not physical objects? One might be dance. Dance is not a physical object. Music is not a physical object. Can you have visual art that is not a physical object? Well, Anna's artwork is not a physical object. It is a video of her setting fire to a sculpture. So what happened to Anna? Most people haven't heard of the artist Anna Mendieta, which is unfortunate because she was really groundbreaking when it comes to performance art, which is our topic for next week. Well, something really tragic and terrible happened to Anna in, I think it was 1984. Anna was living in New York City with her husband. Her husband was an artist named Carl Andre. Andre was a very, very famous artist. He was significantly older than Anna, too. Well, anyway, they were married and they were living in an apartment in New York on like the 30th floor or something of a building in New York City. And Anna and Carl used to fight a lot. They would have these really, really loud screaming matches at each other. And one day, they were having one of these screaming matches, and Anna ended up falling out the window of the apartment, 30th floor. So she was killed. And it is commonly believed that Carl Andre actually pushed Anna out the window. There was a trial. Charges were brought up on Carl Andre for pushing his wife out the window, and he was found not guilty, and is now, still living his life as a very, very, very successful, very, very famous artist. Meanwhile, it is commonly believed that he actually pushed his wife out the window, which led to her death. So there is a lot still, even though this happened in 1984 and is now 2020, there is still a lot of anger that the person who likely killed Anna Mendieta has had no ramifications. And people believe this is because Carl Andre is a very famous and powerful man, whereas Anna Mendieta was an immigrant to this country from Cuba and came here for political asylum. So whenever there is a exhibit of Carl Andre's work, regardless of where it is in the country, there will be protesters that come to the exhibit and protest the exhibit, and they always do the same thing. They wear T-shirts that say, "Where is Anna Mendieta?" And the reason they wear these T-shirts is because they're pointing out that there was no ramifications for the death of Anna Mendieta. They also will pass out cards like this. So this says, Carl Andre is at Mocha Geffen. Mocha Geffen is an art museum. ¿Dónde está Ana Mendieta? It's in Spanish. Where is Ana Mendieta? Carl Andre is at this museum, but where is Ana Mendieta? They will do these protests. They will do performances all as a way to keep Anna's memory alive and also to point out that there were no ramifications for Anna's death. It's a really interesting thing that continues even today, also because it's in the spirit of Anna's work, which is Anna's work is not a physical object. Anna's work is a performance, something that happens. And these protests are similarly performances. There is no physical object left behind. And I'm sorry, this is a really dark ending point to this week's class, but I want you to always know the whole story of an artist, even if that story doesn't end well. But I want to leave you with this final question. Does a work of art have to be a physical object? That's the question that Anna brings up. And that is what we will visit next week. I look forward to seeing your earthworks, and I'll talk to you next week. Bye.